Hello. Thank you for coming. It was quite a trip from the corner of this very same floor for me, so I appreciate everyone else showing up as well. So as Joe said, today I'll be talking about human adaptations for teaching. I'm going to lay out a new theoretical framework for you and also talk about some of my research and my data from my dissertation fieldwork in Fiji. So I'd like to start out with what I hope is an uncontroversial claim. Humans are heavily reliant on cultural adaptations, and we've co-evolved with culture for millennia. So cumulative culture, culture passed down across generations, is especially important for the colonization of diverse environments, and humans have colonized basically all the environments that we have on Earth. So, for example, in the Pacific where I work, people colonized various new islands with these complex, elaborate, double-hulled seafaring canoes using some of their navigation knowledge. This is a Micronesian navigation chart. And then once they got there, they developed and invented new tools to exploit new resources. So for example, this is a squid lure made from carefully selected and treated cowrie shells in order to hunt for squid. So just a few examples of, especially with the navigation in the canoes, multi-generational technology. So for cumulative cultural adaptation to be possible, we have to somehow have faithful transmission. We know how this happens in biological evolution. Genes are fairly simple, actually, in terms of transmission, but it's still not well understood how this happens in terms of cultural transmission. So some anthropologists, cognitive anthropologists, have proposed that people might make inferences based on others' behavior that they see. Now, the problem with this is that there are a number of mental states that can correspond to any behavior. So if you look only at behavior, you infer the mental state, you might acquire the wrong knowledge or the incorrect belief. And so to solve this problem that's known as the frame problem, where you don't have the background knowledge to figure out what the right answer is, these same cognitive anthropologists have proposed that there are cognitive attractors, and these are innate cognitive structures that constrain the range of inferences that a learner can make. So this makes sense for domains in which the content is varying only superficially, but again, humans have this very broad set of ideas and knowledge, very diverse knowledge that we need to acquire, and culture actually evolves faster than biology. So it's unlikely that genetically evolved cognitive attractors could actually keep pace with the demands for acquiring culturally evolving mental representations. So there's all this theory that suggests that teaching is adaptive, it should be common in humans, it should be rare in species that are not dependent on cumulative culture. But there's deep disagreement over how to interpret current evidence on the prevalence of teaching in humans across cultures and in non-human species. So first, ethnographic researchers on childhood and learning claim that teaching is rare or absent in non-Western human societies. So Barry Hewlett gave a few examples if you made it to the previous Beck talk at the end of last quarter. I'll just give a couple examples here. So Paradise et al. Wrote that in communities where children spend much of their day actually taking part in mature activities, they invite children to learn through their experience with little dependence on coercion and explicit teaching. And then Lancey and Grove in 2010 wrote about the near total absence of children being taught in the explanatory didactic sense. And in that same chapter, they go on to write in a footnote about how after reviewing the ethnographic literature, they only found 3 examples of teaching with a capital T. So they're saying that teaching is nearly absent, and that's outside of Western societies. On the other hand, some researchers assume that teaching is a human universal. So Strauss et al. So Strauss et al. Stated that it's almost incontrovertible that teaching is ubiquitous in human beings, which means that with few exceptions, every person in every society has taught and has been taught by others. That's a far stretch from 3 actual examples, right? And then Thornton and McAuliffe in 2012 wrote, "Indeed, all human children need to be taught." I should note that these claims aren't actually coming from anthropologists, and these authors don't have cross-cultural ethnographic work to support their claims. They're just assuming, in most cases, that these are universals. So to further complicate the issue, teaching has been documented either systematically or anecdotally in a number of non-human species. Most of these species are not closely related to humans. They're not even primates. And they don't depend heavily on culture. So this includes some fairly high-profile findings in teaching in tandem running ants, in meerkats, Atlantic spotted dolphins, and wild-pied babblers. Other candidate species also include orca whales, cheetahs, otters, and even domestic cats. So these are, you may notice that these are, as I said, not closely related to humans. They do tend to be predators with either long life histories or with cooperative breeding, but that's sort of another topic for another talk. I'd love to talk about it at the end of this talk. So to refresh, if teaching evolved to facilitate learning in others and can promote faithful cultural transmission, it should be common cross-culturally in humans, and it should be rare in non-cultural species. But what the empirical record looks like now is basically not that. So the question is, why are these predictions not supported by the existing empirical record? And I'm actually going to argue that teaching is not a single behavior, that it's a set of behaviors. And when we view it as a set of adaptations, that then we can understand the pattern, how it varies across cultures and contexts in humans, and also how it varies across species. I'm mostly focusing on humans today, but I did want to mention some of the opportunities for comparing across species. So asking the question of whether teaching is present or absent in a society is basically a non-starter. Instead, we need to ask how teaching behavior varies in adaptive ways according to cost-benefit analyses. So I'm going to ask 2 specific research questions today. First, how does teaching behavior vary in adaptive ways across the life history and across domains? And second, how does the frequency of different teaching types or teaching behaviors vary in adaptive ways? Before we get to that, talk about ethnographic context. So to study variation in teaching empirically, I conduct research at a field site in the Yasawa Islands in Fiji. So this is the Yasawa Island chain. I work on the last of these islands. And the data that I'll present today were collected during 22 months of fieldwork in 4 of the villages on Yasawa Island, and that was between 2008 and 2012. So here's a closer zoom in on Yasawa Island. And the villages that I worked in are Tevi, Dalomo, Bukama, and Yasawa. And that red mark there is the resort. This is the only resort on the island. It's about 20 minutes walk from Bukama village there. It's a high-end resort, so it draws some employees from Bukama, but it also draws high-skill employees from elsewhere in Fiji. So it's not as if many or even most people from these, most or even many people from these other villages are working at this resort. If you have questions about the role of tourism in this society and how it might affect this study, we can talk about that at the end. So just to give you some idea of how people live here, they're very small populations, less than 200 people per village, although they're interconnected, so it's a large community on the island overall. Residence is generally patrilocal. Market integration is fairly low, I would say, with less than a quarter of the daily calories coming from purchased food. More importantly, store-bought food is not always reliably available. So when I've lived there, there have been periods of 2 weeks to a month where you can't get staples like flour or sugar, which people would typically cook with. And so people still require their subsistence skills to get through these periods of shortages. And there are no public utilities such as electricity, running water. There have been cell phones since 2009. People have generators that they use to charge the cell phones off and on. As far as social learning, there have been primary schools, at least one primary school on Yasawa Island since the early 1900s, but access has varied across the different villages, so some of the older people will tell you about having to walk the length of the island nearly to get to school. Overall, school is still pretty much viewed as a means to learn English and a way to access wage labor, but not necessarily as a way to achieve success in village life. And even though there have been primary schools here since the 1900s, Fiji is still used as an example of a place where teaching is thought to be absent. So it's not that I'm choosing a special case where there is teaching. This is representative of those ethnographic samples. So in 1929, Hocourt reported that Fijians thought of children as watery-souled and without minds, and therefore not really able to even receive teaching. But more recently, people have made claims about the lack of teaching or the lack of importance of teaching outside of classrooms in Fiji. So this very much fits in with the general pattern of thought on the role of teaching in non-Western societies. So in this context, let's look at how teaching varies across the lifespan and across domains of learning. Given that teaching is a behavior evolved to facilitate learning in others, the benefits to both teachers and pupils derive from the gains in learning for the pupil. Obviously, this is an indirect benefit where the teacher is concerned. All else being equal, the benefits will be greatest for domains that are highly valued or in which teaching is especially effective, for example, in high skill or causally opaque domains that would otherwise make for fairly slow learning. For teachers, the main cost is teaching effort, or time spent teaching. And for pupils, the main cost includes gaining access to teachers and then the risk of manipulation by a deceptive or selfish teacher. So keeping these general costs in mind, learners should select teachers based on accessibility, on expertise, and also trustworthiness. So social networks, we know, change over the lifespan. Expanding from early social networks consisting mostly of caretakers and close relatives to a broader set of social relationships. So this predicts a two-stage model of social learning and of teaching. First, early in life, when a child's social network may be restricted to caretakers and close relatives, learners may acquire basic skills from anyone that's accessible, so a fairly small group of people. And typically, this is going to be vertical transmission then from parents, grandparents, and potentially other caretakers. Later in life, when social networks expand and learners have a greater ability to shape their own social networks, they may selectively update their skills either through individual learning or practice or through selectively attending to other individuals in the population. So non-parent kin, experts in some domain, and any other non-kin, those are all considered oblique transmission. And I'll go over that in a minute as well. So based on this framework, we can ask, in what context is teaching most likely? So first, teaching should be more common among closely related kin. Second, it should be because it facilitates efficient learning, but it can't speed up physical development, it should be more common in high skill but not high strength domains. And then finally, since the benefits of teaching would be greatest for domains that have high impact on fitness, teaching should be more common in domains that are perceived as important to success. We can make 2 additional predictions based on the 2-stage model of social learning. First, early in life, learning or transmission from parents or grandparents should be common, so vertical transmission should be more common. And later in life, oblique transmission should be more common as those social networks shift and expand. Second, since high-skilled tasks may be best learned from an expert and domains requiring greater skill but not, since high-skilled tasks may be best learned from an expert, that predicts that these high-skilled domains should be learned through oblique transmission, non-parents or grandparents. So I gathered data on these questions through a set of 3 interviews in Fiji, and these were conducted in standard Fijian. Participants were randomly sampled from the demographic database, which covers the whole village. And I did maintain equal numbers of men and women and interviewed only adults for this project, 18 and older. So in the first interview, which I'm calling the Domains of Success interview, we asked 72 participants, what are the areas of skill, knowledge, or success that make one a well-respected member of the community here? And you may notice that schooling, for example, is not included. That didn't come up as something that was very important, which reinforces what I was saying earlier in the ethnographic context section. So the domains listed here are those that were listed most often by participants for men and for women. This list is slightly modified, so I removed things that Fijians think of as being inherited because I want to focus on learning. So I took out personality traits and chiefly rank, for example. And then I added in 2 high-skill domains that were not mentioned by participants, but which gain people respect and success in the village. I think they weren't mentioned because we ask this generally as something that's important to everyone, and not everyone actually masters traditional medicine or captaining a boat. So in the next interview, which I'm calling the Children's Learning Interview, I asked 3 relevant questions. So for those important target domains that I just showed you in the previous slide, I asked how children learn this, or how they learn to do it, and at what age. I did ask separate questions for boys and girls for those domains. I also asked an open-ended question about what type of work children should do for the household, and at what age they should begin doing that type of work. So then I coded the responses to those questions in terms of learning processes and social learning pathways. Learning processes that I coded include learning by doing, seeing, hearing, imitating, and teaching. There are multiple terms for all of these, but I'm just going to explain the ones for teaching. So I coded something as learning by teaching if they included the words for taught, told versus just hearing something, corrected or straightened out, and then shown versus just seeing something. And then I coded social learning pathways as vertical if parents or grandparents were mentioned as the source of the knowledge, as horizontal if peers, friends, or siblings were mentioned, and then as oblique if experts, elders, or other kin were listed as the source of the knowledge or skill. So because the format of the question did not force participants to name either a learning process or a pathway, they could potentially name more than one of either of these, and you'll see that in the outcome of the data. So the third interview was actually a card ranking test where participants did forced pair comparisons of 25 domains that were written on index cards, and they were asked which one is more difficult in terms of strength and in terms of skill. So they did these rankings separately, 2 separate rankings, one for strength, one for skill, and those were counterbalanced across participants. Okay. Finally, what you've been waiting for, and I should mention he didn't actually catch these fish. It's this man back here that caught the fish. That would be truly impressive for like a 12-year-old. So just to remind you of the predictions, I'm going to use these data to test whether teaching is more common among closely related kin, for difficult domains and for domains that are considered important in terms of success in village life. So first, teaching is associated with vertical transmission. So yeah, my battery didn't die. Such that the more important a domain is reported to be, the more a domain is reported to be learned from parents or grandparents, which makes it vertical transmission, the more likely it is to also be associated with teaching. So just to walk you through this plot, it's the results of a linear regression. The error bars are standard error, and each of these letters stands for one of those key domains. So boating, house building here, gathering on the reef, diving, which is one type of fishing that they do, Fijian medicine, cooking, farming, and weaving. They weave large mats.
So
yeah.
I've asked you this like 400 times, but can you explain the double error bars again?
Right, so because, as I mentioned, it's open-ended, so not all participants had to name, they weren't forced to name teaching yes or no, and they weren't forced to name vertical transmission yes or no, or even any. So this is sorted by domain, the probability that vertical transmission is elected. And so the error bar is whether or not vertical transmission is listed by participants if they choose to list a source of transmission. And then the same thing for teaching. If they list a learning process, whether or not they list teaching. So the error bars are different because it's a different group of participants I'm drawing, not a different group, but a different subset of the interviewees that's responding about teaching versus vertical transmission. So the statistics on the presentation get a little bit messy, but it's actually lending some ecological validity here because I didn't give them a multiple choice. I didn't force them to say, and do you teach that, yes or no? They basically came up with these explanations themselves without me using the word teaching. So, trade-offs. Okay, you set on this. All right, good, because we're going to see another graph. So this is basically the same thing. Again, it's a linear regression. Here, I'm showing the probability that teaching is listed as the learning process by the probability that oblique transmission is listed as learning process. And you might notice that these basically look like inversions of one another, and that's because, the third possibility, horizontal transmission, is so rare for these domains that it doesn't really have an effect on the total proportions in terms of oblique versus vertical transmission. And I think, I'm getting a little ahead here, but I think that's because, remember, we started out with domains that people said were very important to them. And it's unlikely that these very important domains are going to be learned just from same-age peers. Okay. So I also found that parents are the most frequent teachers when a teacher is actually listed. So this plot shows the percentage of times that a given kin group, and it's a bit small, I apologize. So this is parents here, and then we have siblings, grandparents, elders, which could include a variety of more distant kin who are just older, experts, peers, villagers, school, and other. And villagers, school, other, and siblings were all mentioned as sources of transmission, but were never associated with teaching. So people never said they were taught by their sibling, but they did frequently say that they're taught or told by their parents. So again, what this shows is that for parents, when participants did list parents, 74% of the time they listed a parent as a source of learning. They also included teaching in their explanation. And only parents were positively associated statistically with teaching. These other groups don't differ from each other, as you can see from the error bars, and they're also not particularly associated with teaching. So in the next data set, I'll actually show you some better evidence about the role of biological kinship in teaching. But for now, this is the interview data I have. Yep.
So, Michelle, just to be clear, so with siblings, they would have said something like, I watched my sister do it, or something like that, and that would not be categorized. It would be a source of transmission, but it wouldn't be characterized as teaching versus with parents. They would
Right.
say,
Or it might be something like they learn from their brother with no learning source represented. So these lower bars, probably more often people are saying learn by seeing, learn by doing, learn by imitating, anything other than those teaching keywords. So there's also some support for the prediction that high skill domains are associated with teaching. So this table shows the results of a linear prediction, or a linear regression predicting the teaching rates for a given domain from that domain's skill difficulty ranking. And these are, again, for those 8 target domains, those important domains. So while the model for skill difficulty in teaching alone is not significant, if you control for vertical transmission, which I've shown you is associated with teaching, you actually find that the role of skill difficulty approaches significance, and the beta value increases dramatically. But then if you control for this other thing that I'm saying is important, importance to success, that effect basically goes away. So it may be that this is a small sample, it's based on these 8 domains, or it may be that there really is no effect here. There's a suggestion of effect, need better data. Finally, when we just look at importance to success, there's a strong positive effect on teaching, which supports the third prediction, that the more important a domain is, the more likely you are to have teaching, because it has a bigger effect, presumably on fitness. So remember, we had 2 other predictions that are based on the 2-stage life history model. I'm going to test these predictions based on these data. I just wanted to remind you, so the prediction is that vertical transmission is common early, oblique transmission common later, and domains requiring greater skill but not greater strength will be associated with oblique transmission. So vertical transmission is associated with early start age. And don't worry, I'm going to walk you through this. So this plot is showing the results of a logistic regression. And these are actually the probabilities of transmission by 3 different possible pathways. So the darkest gray here is vertical transmission. The shaded area is a 95% confidence interval. So the x-axis is the age at which people said children should start learning about this domain. The y-axis is the likelihood that participants elected one of these transmission pathways. So the likelihood of vertical transmission decreases as start age increases. The likelihood of oblique transmission increases as start age increases. And for horizontal transmission, as I said, it's fairly low for all of these domains. And this is based on, again, those 8 domains with 41 participant responses. And, okay, any questions about this? Because we're about to see another plot that's very similar. Okay. So high-skill domains are also associated with oblique transmission, while low-skill domains are associated with vertical transmission. So again, these are probability curves from a logistic regression, predicting for each pathway the likelihood of transmission by that pathway. This time, instead of age, it's skill difficulty on the x-axis. So vertical transmission becomes less likely as skill difficulty increases. This means that the more difficult people rated a skill, the less likely people were to say that it was learned from mom, dad, or grandparents. For oblique transmission, the likelihood of oblique transmission increases with skill difficulty, And then for horizontal transmission, again, it's fairly low to begin with and it drops off. I wouldn't put too much stock in this, again, because we're looking at these these highly important domains. Okay, so in concluding this section, I found that, at least according to our participants, teaching is not only present, but it varies in ways that are predicted by evolutionary cost-benefit analyses. Further, the frequency of teaching varies in predictable ways, given what we know about the life history of the human species, the way that social networks shift across human life history. So this suggests that the ethnographic accounts that are describing an absence of teaching are either inaccurate or they're talking about some other kind of teaching. And so it's possible that they're talking about classroom Western style teaching and the type of sort of baby Einstein almost over teaching that we do in the West. It's not really clear to me if that's true. What is clear is that Fijians do think that adults facilitate learning in children through teaching. And now the question becomes, what does teaching in Fiji look like? So this supports the general idea that I'm getting at, but it leaves open these questions about what teaching looks like day to day, how frequent is it, and what sort of behaviors are we actually talking about. And in this context, I want to switch over to that second question, look at how observed teaching behavior varies according to, again, these cost-benefit analyses. So let's return to that simple definition of teaching as behavior evolved to facilitate learning in others. For social learners, there are essentially two problems that might inhibit learning. One is that the learner might lack attention or motivation to learn about something, and without prompting, they might never actually explore it. Another separate problem is that learners might lack access to a stimulus, information, or experience. They may be interested in it, but they may be not able to explore it for various reasons, including danger, or it's just difficult to get to, for example. So if you combine these two, there are a number of unique social learning problems, and I'm going to propose a number of different types of teaching adaptations that can solve those learning problems. So one possibility is that a student has motivation and is interested in something, wants to learn about it, but they don't have access to it unless they're granted it by some other person. So in this situation, a teacher could facilitate a pupil's learning by granting them that access, which I call teaching via social tolerance. So here's an example from Fiji. Hopefully you can see the picture all right. This is a 3-year-old girl. And she is very interested in this mortar and pestle, which is full of garlic. She's putting her hand in. She's kind of standing in front of the woman who's trying to pound the pestle. And she's touching, she's observing, she's constantly in the way. The young woman, rather than removing the little girl from the situation, tolerates that, stops, lets the girl manipulate the objects, lets her put her hands in the food, and doesn't make her go away. So again, this is an example of teaching by social tolerance, where the pupil has the motivation but no access, and she's granted access by the teacher. So in a different situation, a learner may have the motivation to learn about something but doesn't have access to it because it's dangerous, difficult, or otherwise impossible. And a teacher may provide access to a learning opportunity. So this is a little more effort on the teacher's part. They're providing an opportunity. And I'm calling this teaching via opportunity provisioning. So for example, in this case, this is a 2-year-old girl, and she has a small fish by the head here. She would never be able to actually catch this fish herself. They're pretty fast. I can't catch one. But her father was sitting in the shallows at the time, cleaning out other fish. These fish come and scavenge. He grabbed this fish, called the girl over from across the beach, and handed the fish to her to play with. So this is an example of teaching via opportunity provisioning. So here's a third situation. Pupils could have access to learn about something. So this is a very different situation from the previous two. They may even have some of the knowledge or that behavior in their repertoire, but they're over or underusing that behavior. When this is true, a teacher might provide positive or negative reinforcement to motivate the pupil to use the behavior appropriately or to react to a given stimulus in a particular way. So this is what I would call teaching via behavioral conditioning. And in this example, there are two little boys who are playing loudly in the village green. They know this is against the rule. You're not allowed to do this in the village, but they're doing it anyways. And one of the boys' fathers leans out the window, tells them they have to stop. They need to go to the beach where it's allowed. And after they protest for a bit, the kids finally do move to the beach where they're actually allowed to do rough and tumble play. So this is actually a really typical example according to the responses on that child learning interview that I talked about. This is the sort of way, according to Fijian parents especially, that kids learn to behave appropriately and obey village rules. And again, this is an example of teaching via behavioral conditioning. So fourth, learners might have access to something relevant to learn about, but in this case, they might not actually have the motivation. They may not know that it's relevant to learn about. So they only begin learning once someone else provokes their interest, draws their interest to the thing that they will learn about. So I call this teaching via stimulus or local enhancement. And in this case, there's a 13-year-old girl in this far corner over here. And what she's done is led these three younger girls to a particular spot where she can crack TV nuts, which are sort of kind of like almonds, but they're found on the beach, and a lot of kids will crack them open and eat them as a snack. So the youngest girl here is 2.5. She doesn't have much experience with nut cracking. She's actually just moved here from the city to live with her grandparents. And from this experience of following these older girls, she learns that the nuts are good to eat. She learns that this is a particularly good spot for nuts. She learns that there's a hammer and anvil involved and that you have to crack them open to extract the food. So without these older girls, she probably never would have come to realize that these small, sort of hard things laying around the beach are actually food. So again, that's teaching by stimulus or local enhancement. Finally, in some cases, pupils may have so little background information that they're not able to independently solve the frame problem in order to figure out what it is that's important to learn. So they never actually, motivation is not a question and access is not a question because they never realize this is something that's important. So they have neither motivation nor access. And for cases like this, a teacher can direct the pupil's attention and verbally explain, demonstrate, or combine verbal and visual information to direct the pupil's learning and convey relevant, generalizable information. So this is what I call direct active teaching, and I think this is probably what most people think about when they just say teaching. This may be what the type of teaching that most anthropologists are talking about when they're doing ethnography. So in the examples pictured here, this is actually the same father-daughter pair. The picture on the right is 2 years earlier than the picture on the left. So on the right, the father is showing the girl how to slice open and clean out turtle intestines. People do eat the intestines after it's cleaned out, so it is an important job. And he then hands it over to her to finish that job. 2 years later, you can see him pointing here with his pinky finger to the particular place inside the turtle where you detach the intestines to extract them from the turtle and then later clean them out. So I don't have any systematic data to base this on, but in my opinion, this is a more difficult job, right? So if she bungles the cleaning of the intestines, you just clean it again. But if you mess up when you're taking the intestines out here, you contaminate the rest of the food that's in that turtle shell. So not only is this direct active teaching, but it appears to be progressing based on the girl's skill and knowledge over the course of a couple years. So that's the extent of the taxonomy. The set of behaviors that I've laid out subsumes other definitions, so it includes teaching as defined by the teacher's intent to teach, which is one commonly used definition. But the teacher doesn't have to consciously be intending to teach by my taxonomy. It also includes culture-specific forms of teaching like that in Western classrooms, or proposed culturally specific forms. And it includes behaviors that facilitate others' learning, whether or not there's a cost to the teacher. This is a definition often used in animal behavior or biology definitions. So I'm including all of those, but then redividing them up in this new taxonomy. So recall that while the benefits for teachers and pupils both derive from pupil gains in learning, for teachers, the greatest cost is teaching effort. And for pupils, the costs include gaining access to teachers and risk of manipulation. So here I'm going to focus more on predictions from the teacher's point of view, from the costs to the teacher. So teaching types that are most costly to teachers should be relatively rare. So for example, direct active teaching and opportunity provisioning, just based on theory, are more costly. They take more effort. In addition, for any teaching type, the more costly specific behaviors that are contained in that type should also be relatively rare. And then finally, teaching should be more common among closely related individuals because the indirect benefits offset the cost of teaching for teachers. So to test these predictions, I conducted focal follows of children in Yasawa villages. All of the focals were between 1 and 6 years old. They hadn't attended primary school yet. Some of them did attend preschool, which is sort of a new thing across Fiji. And so I did do 16 follows during preschool, and I excluded them from these analyses. But that will be an interesting contrast to make in the future. So these follows were continuous coding. They were 20 minutes each. I used a Scion workabout handheld computer, and so all of the entries were time-stamped. I do have time data, although I won't be showing that today. And then at the end of the day, I appended qualitative field notes to those behavioral codings. The codes are based on an ethogram that I developed from the teaching taxonomy and from 3 months of video recorded pilot observations, which are sort of along the lines of what you actually saw in Barry Hewlett's talk, if you made it to that one. So my codes include things like caretaking, activity context, general social and asocial behaviors, but most importantly, they include specific codes for behavioral indicators of the different teaching types. And I will run through those now fairly quickly, and we'll get to the data. So these are going to be all the same teaching types that I introduced with examples previously. So where there is motivation but no access, and it's classified as social tolerance, the behavioral indicators include touching the actor or the stimulus, interfering in what another person is doing, staying within one arm length such that touching is possible, or following within reach as that person moves from place to place. So this is described from the point of view of the focal child. So these acts of interference were considered tolerated if the actor did not verbally or physically force the focal to stop, the child to stop, or send the child away. Protesting by the actor without enforcement was still considered tolerance. So in teaching by opportunity provisioning, this was indicated by situations in which the focal individual was engaged in some action or activity that was prompted by another actor, so they were assigned a task or told to do a task, or prompted and assisted by another actor, or if they were inspecting a stimulus that was made accessible by another individual. So for example, taking something down off a shelf and handing it to a child would count as opportunity provisioning, if that's something that the child couldn't get access to. So teaching by behavioral conditioning is indicated by a number of behaviors. This includes positive or negative valuation, usually verbal, sometimes gestural, encouragement, discouragement. The command to stop or command don't, being commanded to repeat a verbal phrase, which is kind of a common thing in Fiji, whispering to a child to shout this phrase out. warning that something is dangerous, such as if a child's approaching a hot teapot, for example. And then actual punishment or reward, which is similar to valuation but goes beyond just verbal reinforcement. So also to be conservative, I coded for when there was fighting or arguing going on, and I removed those examples for this type of teaching because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just coding arguments over resources between two individuals. So some of this is fairly conservative, I think, to take all of those out. So teaching by stimulus or local enhancement was indicated by an actor verbally or gesturally drawing the focal's attention to something or giving the command to watch someone. Again, to be conservative, I took out instances of drawing attention to the self because in some cases, especially when you're following kids between the ages of 1 to 6, there's a lot of drawing attention to yourself for basically showing off, right? Look at me, I can jump up and down more than you can, or something like that. In the future, I can go back through, and because I have the qualitative field notes, I can distinguish between different types of drawing attention to the self. Finally, for direct active teaching, this was indicated by an actor's production of abstract information, including abstract rules, or through demonstration or emphasis of information to the focal by an actor. And for all of these analyses, I considered teaching behaviors directed toward the focal, not towards a third party, and not from the focal towards another individual. There are some cases where my focal was teaching another individual, but those aren't included here. So again, the predictions, I'm predicting that the most costly teaching types should be rare, the most costly behaviors should be rare, and then that teaching should be most common among closely related kin. But before actually testing the predictions, we should ask just in general, how common is teaching across all categories in the daily lives of these kids? So I found that teaching is fairly ubiquitous when categorized in the way that I did. So on the x-axis here, you see the number of teaching types per follow. And on the y-axis, it's the percent of the follows that included this number of types. So to summarize, 93% of the follows included some teaching, and the majority of follows had between 1 and 3 types of teaching. And again, these were only 20 minutes long, so it's not as if this is in a full day. So it's fairly frequent. Okay, so I did find that costly teaching types are less frequent. So in red, I have the 2 hypothesized costly teaching types, opportunity provisioning and direct active teaching, in contrast to social tolerance, teaching by enhancement, and behavioral conditioning. If you were paying close attention and you had finished your lunch, you might wonder, what about social tolerance? This is the one, right, where all they do is let the kid interfere. It's possibly the lowest cost. But remember, my hypotheses are in terms of the cost to the teacher, whereas social tolerance is the only one of these different types that's initiated by the child. So if we actually look from the teacher's perspective and see when the child initiates interference, when is it tolerated, rather than when is the child actually moved aside, it turns out that all types, following closely, touching, interfering, and staying close, are tolerated by adults, or tolerated by others, I should say, not necessarily adults, between 70 and 100% of the time. So if you look at it from the teacher's perspective, the rates of tolerance are fairly high. The question then becomes, why do kids not interfere more? And I don't have a good answer for that at this point. Yeah?
So that on the previous slide,
Yes.
so it would be counted as present. One instance of like me being as close as I am to Stacy would be counted. If you saw that once, that would be counted as an instance of social tolerance, and that only happened like 18% of the follows, that the child was in that close of contact to an adult?
So it's also that they're interacting. So if they're not interacting or attending in any way, they're just sitting next to each other facing in different directions, it doesn't count. And it had to be, so it had to be that they were either, so you can actually look at.
Do you have codes for that other than the codes you had? Because the codes you listed were just about proximity, basically.
Right. So if they're following closely, which means maintaining one arm length distance, if they're actually touching and interfering, or if they're kind of hovering, basically staying closely, which is within a child's arm's length, I should say, not the adult's arm's length, which basically this is saying if they're staying close, it means that they could touch at any point in time. And yeah, that was actually fairly rare. So I think, kids do get disciplined physically, and so I think maybe the kids are not being too nosy until they're very interested in something. Or they're already included in participating, and so they're not interfering. So if they were interacting with the person, I didn't code this as, so it's not strictly proximity. It's proximity plus interference.
But you didn't code it, like if they were direct active teaching, and by virtue of that they were close to each other, that got coded only as direct active and not as social tolerance?
If the adult was doing an independent activity and the child was interfering in that as measured by these three indicators, then yeah, I would code for these. But if they were actively engaged in playing a patty cake game or something like that, it wouldn't be coded as interference. So this is not a good measure of just proximity alone. Yeah, it's something different.
That would mean that there's a bunch of social tolerance that's sort of subsumed into other categories, right?
So I think, right, so I think the way to think about social tolerance is that the adult isn't really actively doing anything. But obviously, if the adult is actively doing something, actively teaching, they're tolerating the child's presence clearly if they're interacting. So this is in cases where the adult is not actively engaging with the child, but the child is pursuing the adult. It's one directional, and the adult's tolerating it. And I'm saying adult, but I should be saying actor or something, because it could be older kids, or kids the same age even. Okay, so, right, that's just an example of why it's important to have these specific behavioral codes, because we can really take it apart and think about it that way, whereas if you just use your own judgment and say, yeah, that looks like social tolerance, it's hard to think about what behavior is actually going on.
Maybe one way to underscore the costs to the model of the tolerance is to look at the frequency with which children are shooed away. Right? So, if kids are frequently being told, get lost, you're in the way, get out of the way, etc., right? Or growled at, then that highlights when you're allowing the learner to get in the way.
Right, and it's true that adults sometimes preemptively make kids leave. So there is some where a kid starts to walk in and then, go away, okay, I'll be outside, that sort of thing. So that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in these tolerance rates. Okay, and I have a separate code for that. That's how common it is, so I can look at that. Okay, so if we look at we looked at teaching types generally. Now if we look at the behavioral indicators within each teaching type and identify the ones that are, again, theoretically more costly, you see the same pattern. So costly teaching behaviors are less frequent. So this is within opportunity provisioning. These are the behavioral codes that I explained previously. Assigning a task is fairly common. Granting access to a stimulus is fairly common. Assigning a task and then accompanying the kid and modifying the task so that the child can actually do that task is the most rare and the most costly of these. And then we can do the same thing for teaching by behavioral conditioning. Again, this is I didn't explain the y-axis here. So this is the percent of opportunity provisioning instances that fall into each of these categories. And here it's the percent of behavioral conditioning instances that are indicated by these different behaviors. There can be multiple indicators so a single instance can fall in multiple bars here, which is why they don't total 100%. So here, if you compare all the various indicators, these are positive evaluation, telling a child to stop, negative evaluation, telling a child to stop, positive evaluation, telling a child to repeat a vocalization, warning of danger, and then actual punishment and reward, which I define as something beyond just verbal or gestural reinforcement. So this would actually be, spanking the kid, picking the kid up, putting them somewhere else, forcing them to leave. Those are the two most rare types. And in fact, there was never an instance of rewards within my sample. So I only saw punishments, and it looks like about, 14% of these cases included actual punishment. And I think the reward one is especially interesting, given that there's not an absence of positive evaluation or encouragement, but people don't present rewards. So then if we look again at direct active teaching and we break it down into presenting abstract information or rules, so that's purely verbal, or showing or demonstrating something. Abstract information is more popular than actual showing or demonstrating. And abstract information, remember, is something that you can be telling a child while you're completing another task, whereas showing or demonstrating requires the teacher to stop what they're doing, do something else, or alter what they're doing in some way to show the child. So finally, this plot shows the average number of teaching events per focal dyad in the population on the y-axis, and by relatedness of that dyad on the x-axis. Yep.
One quick question about the previous slide.
Yes.
How much do those two things co-occur? So I assume that if both were happening at the same time, you marked them both, right? But just
I can't tell you off the top of my head. A lot of this abstract information or rules was, don't do that, that's taboo, you're not allowed to do that. So a lot of it was just telling kids, stop it, that's against the rules. You're not allowed to do that. This was not a lot of, let me sit you down and tell you about, how a fire works or something like that. But I can look and see.
And regular talking while showing wouldn't count because it has to be abstract information that they're presenting.
Right. So those are
Just cut this while.
right. But during this, during demonstration, remember I'm coding the indicators of teaching. So you could have teaching types overlapping. So you could have demonstration, you could also have the child do something and get encouragement. And the way that these are coded right now, you wouldn't be able to separate those two. I will eventually, but this round of coding doesn't distinguish between those two. Okay, so overall, the mean number of teaching events per dyad is higher for more closely related dyads. These are preliminary data, so I don't actually have, the way that I calculated this, these are just totals across the whole sample, so there's not really an error statistic to provide, but there will be eventually. So there's a pretty strong pattern. This does control for the number of those relationships in the population. So people have a lot more distant relatives than they have parents, right? The maximum number of parents is 2. You could also add siblings in, but this is a pretty strong pattern. Okay, so in some sense, the new body of theory empirical tests I've presented here solve that puzzle of teaching that I posed in the beginning. And they do that by reorganizing the empirical record and providing some new observational evidence. So teaching is not absent, nor is it especially rare in Fiji in children's daily lives. Direct active teaching, which is costly and appears to be unique to humans, and it's up in the air whether this is universal or culturally unique, but I found that it was present in Fiji. It's actually present in 30% of the follows. So this is in direct contradiction to some of the ethnographic claims that have been made. And as predicted, less costly teaching types are more common. This is consistent with evolutionary theory on teaching. We would also expect the same patterning to happen in non-human animals. Finally, relatedness predicts the frequency of teaching, and hopefully future analyses, rather than saying, theoretically these are more costly acts of teaching, future analyses I can use those timestamp data to actually measure how much effort people are putting towards teaching. So these focal follow data are a fairly rich data set, and future analyses can expand on what I've shown you today. So in summary, my research takes as a starting point one of the basic truths of anthropology, that humans are biologically cultural as a species, and generates and empirically tests predictions and implications of that idea for the evolution of teaching. Part of this approach is to test these predictions cross-culturally and to make sense of what humans do in comparison with non-human animals. So I hope I've started to do that with the framework and the data I've presented today, and that we're taking a step towards understanding the evolution of teaching. So I would like to thank you and my hosts and participants on Yasawa Island, my co-authors, my research team, and of course the funding sources. And I'm happy to take questions. Yep.
So I'm not sure I really believe this objection, but let me put it out there and see if this one concerns your both your prediction and your positive finding that difficulty of teaching should be correlated with oblique rather than vertical transmission. So suppose it's the case, difficulty of skill, not difficulty.
Right.
Suppose it's the case that people have a heuristic when trying to decide how difficult something is, which is what fraction of the population can do it. Okay? So if everyone can do it, it's easy, and if 1% can do it, then it's hard. Right? Then there's a certain typology in your prediction. If people are using a heuristic like that and answering the question, how difficult is this? Right? Then by definition, oblique transmission is going to be more common in difficult skills because they fall into the difficult category in such a way that vertical transmission is going to be precluded in the majority of cases.
I don't think my results are strong enough for that to be true, actually. And part of the reason that they're not that strong is because one of the very high-skill tasks, which is boat piloting, which there are only like 3 people whose boat I would get in. And for that domain, people did not say that that was taught. I've been told anecdotally that people's fathers have taught them, but in this interview, people did not say that it was taught. And that struck me as really weird, so I went back and I looked, and I know who the captains are, so I went back and I looked and I thought, well, maybe nobody knows how it's learned because most people aren't captains, but the people who are captains also did not say that it was taught. And I think that's partly because it's basically an apprenticeship model. People serve as boat boy for a while and learn a lot about boating that's not explicitly taught to them. But I think it's possible people are using some heuristic, but I don't think that that's the heuristic they're using because the results would be, I think they'd be dramatically stronger if that was true. And because of the boating example. Clark.
Somewhat open-ended question, but you started off by saying that you thought that teaching was an adaptation, or maybe multiple adaptations. What do you think those adaptations are? Like, how would you
So I think humans already have a lot of the communication skills that are required to teach. I think that the teaching types that I listed do not necessarily require theory of mind, although theory of mind might make them easier to do or more frequent. So I think the main adaptation is the motivation to actually benefit another in this way. And so obviously it doesn't have to be abstract reasoning I would like to teach someone, but I think the main adaptation is the cooperative aspect of teaching. And so when I kind of motioned at some of the other animals, ants are eusocial insects and meerkats are cooperative breeders. And it seems like they've solved, I think that the ants teaching example is a borderline one, and people that study ants really don't like it. So caveat there, but with meerkats especially, it's not that they're mastering theory of mind or something like that. So I don't think that it's theory of mind or communication necessarily. I think we have those for other reasons, and it's the motivation that's the new thing.
So do you think, that makes sense, definitely the motivational part would have to be part of it, but so are you then saying that all the inferential parts of teaching are byproducts of other things, and that all you need is everything else you can already do plus a desire to teach? I think they're separate because, as you know, Berge and Gibra and other people have proposed that there's inferential aspects to it so that children, for example, on the learner side have to recognize
Right.
that a teaching event is happening, or they don't have to, they benefit more when they recognize that there's a demonstration occurring, things like that, which is
Right.
inferential just as much motivational.
So I would say that for most of the teaching types that I'm talking about, there's not a lot of inference to be made. So often it's just, so tolerating a kid interfering, no one has to infer really much of anything. You just have to be extra tolerant of naive individuals. I think, so I tend to be more minimalist in terms of how much hardware or software, of how much extra stuff needs to have evolved to make teaching possible. But I think certainly things like that could improve the efficiency of teaching. But in terms of the evolutionary history of teaching evolving as a behavior, I think you could get teaching evolving as a behavior without having all these inferential capabilities and theory of mind capabilities. But if you combine those, then it becomes a more complex form of behavior, maybe.
One last thing and then I'll shut up. You said, because I think where we're thinking about is, that I completely agree with your point at the beginning about the fidelity of transmission, that teaching, one of its functions could be to improve fidelity. And if that's the case, it seems to me there has to be other stuff besides just motivation in order to get the fidelity. Unless you think that comes...
But so it depends on whether you think, I haven't talked about language at all, really. But a bunch of the stuff that I coded has to do with verbal behavior, right? So I think it depends on how you think language evolved, whether it evolved as, Gerge and Chibra in some places say that teaching is the reason that linguistic abilities evolved, right? Which is a very strong argument and usually not the direction that the argument goes in. So if we already have linguistic capabilities, then you're not evolving those anew for teaching, but you are using them for teaching, for example. So I think that those play a role, but I'm not sure that I would say that this is the selection pressure that caused those capabilities to evolve. Are you sure you want Okay, Stacy had a question.
So it seems like you've been willing to take a leap here and call things that have been described in the animal literature as occurring, but have not been described as teaching, right? So social tolerance is something that we see a lot in non-human animals, but no one's ever been willing to call that teaching. And same thing with verbal warnings, right? I mean, you can think of an alarm call, it's just a verbal warning. But nobody, at least as far as I'm aware, Susan's the person asked, right? Nobody's ever been willing to call that teaching.
So I wouldn't call all social tolerance teaching. There's a reason why I have these specific behavioral indicators, and it's because I think they're unique to teaching through social tolerance. So I think that social tolerance used in particular situations is an adaptation for teaching. But for example, just tolerating someone feeding at the same site as you because it's costly to go and chase them off, I wouldn't categorize that as teaching. And that's because it goes back to the social learning problem that's solved. So having interest in learning about the thing but not having access to it unless it's through this other individual. So the way that I've designed this, I think that distinguishes between just all acts of social tolerance, like, you're all tolerating each other's presence and sitting quite close together in a room, but I wouldn't argue that you're teaching each other anything. So I think that the way that I've designed this framework distinguishes. If it doesn't, then we need more work on the framework.
But your 3-year-old dipping their fingers in your cake batter while you're making a cake, that you would have coded as social tolerance and counted that as teaching, right? I guess I'm a little skeptical about whether I
Right.
would call that teaching or not.
Well, I mean, she's not feeding, right? So.
She's just telling, it's a kid and it's sticky and
Right, and so there are some examples of, I think some of what Susan's documented in Capuchins I would call teaching, especially if it's selective tolerance towards a particular subgroup of naive individuals.
Right, I mean, the most common example, or the easiest example to think about, right, is probably chimpanzees and nutcracking.
Right, I would definitely call that teaching.
Right, so
I think.
Is being very tolerant of her offspring, interfering with her efforts to crack nuts. You would qualify that as teaching?
I would, yeah, by social tolerance, which I think is a psychologically and behavioral distinct thing from something like direct active teaching or what I'm doing now, for example.
So would you call it social tolerance, so feeding scrounging, if it were not a difficult to process food, would you call that teaching too? But it could be learning about what to eat, but would that still qualify in your definition?
Are they interfering with the other individual in some way?
It could be sometimes, but wouldn't always be.
So what I think needs to be done is an actual empirical comparison of if we used this coding scheme, made appropriate for, obviously capuchins aren't doing all the same behaviors as people are, and if it looks like, using reasonable judgment, it looks like we're getting a bunch of false positives, then we need to revise the coding scheme, basically. So my goal was to avoid just all social tolerance, obviously, being counted as teaching, because you're no longer doing any work with the construct, basically. It's not interesting anymore. But Chris has had a question for a while.
So you wouldn't need an inference on the child's part. So if they weren't shooed away, the kid doesn't need to infer that this is a teaching moment because they're not shooing me away. They're actually letting me. You don't need that. You don't need that at all.
No.
So going back to this question of when social tolerance is teaching, it's just a version of the flip side of my earlier remark, which is that the base rate matters. So if I tolerate a given individual who engages in all kinds of intrusive activities, many of which interrupt what I'm doing, but don't necessarily facilitate learning on that individual's part. So my grandson likes to play with my glasses and stick his fingers up my nose and a bunch of other things that make it hard to work on a computer, right? But he's not learning anything without using a computer while he's doing that. But I tolerate him. That's a different kind of social tolerance than if I let him go and push on the keys while I'm typing. Without the base rate, you can't distinguish. You can say, well, individuals are tolerant of kin, for example. Well, yeah, they are, but that doesn't mean that they're teaching.
Right.
And Chris's point, he was phrasing it as a question, but I think this goes back to what Clark said earlier, you do actually have to have some kind of intentionality, right? You have to infer, at least you as the observer have to infer, that the child is attempting to acquire information about the adult's activity. Because otherwise, you group together the, sticking the finger up the nose versus the tapping on the feet.
Maybe. I want to be careful in the way that we're talking about intentionality, because there is a whole school of people that's writing about teaching in terms of intentions. And when they say that, they're not talking about it's apparent to an observer that the intention of the teacher is to facilitate learning, but that consciously the teacher is thinking to themselves, I am now teaching. And so I would definitely disagree with that. I'm not sure if I agree with what you're saying. I've broken everything. Okay, well, I don't need that anyway, so if you can ignore that, we can keep, yeah.
One question I have, at the beginning it seemed as if you thought that all the benefits were for the learner and there were no benefits to the teacher. Is that correct?
I think that for the most part, the benefits that the teacher gains are through improved learning on the pupil's part. I could imagine some cases where the teacher benefits because the learner becomes independent more quickly, for example. So like in meerkats, they're social breeders, so it's not just the parents that are putting a lot of effort into teaching the pups to hunt and feed on their own. It's also other more distant relatives. And so some of the gains to them is probably that they don't have to spend as much time in their lives feeding these pups and as much energy feeding these pups, but you can't actually compare whether that's a gain because you don't have the hypothetical non-teaching.
In this situation, isn't there any economic gain to the family unit for the kids learning how to vet the turtle properly or participate
Right.
in the agriculture?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. So either independence or just, I'm thinking of it in terms of economic independence in that they're carrying their own weight and providing something back, not just receiving resources from the family. So one thing I've thought about doing is, because I did code for what activity they're engaged in, you would expect that activities in which kids are expected to give back to the household fairly early might have teaching fairly early, whereas other types would have teaching fairly late.
Well, weaving and cooking and
Right.
agricultural things, aren't kids considered sort of employees?
So, yeah, so I do have a slide. I'll just tell you what's on the slide since I'm disconnected by accident. So young kids at the age that I'm looking at do things like fetch water, they take care of other kids, they fetch firewood, they wash dishes, they collect coconut, they sort of cut grass, but they're not very good at it. They do like laundry, they might do some cooking related tasks. But those are really only the kids at the top of what I'm looking at in my focal follows. So you might expect that there's some teaching in those areas where they start to give back. The problem is that a lot of the things that they do, I think, by the time they're big enough to actually do them, they already know. They've already learned by seeing it that in order to wash something, you wipe the soap against it, and then you wipe a brush against it, and then you dunk it in water. So I think there's some effects of human life history that make it hard to study that topic. I'm trying to think of ways to get data to look at that, though. Maybe through interview data. The evidence on teaching, I think, is not as clear when you ask people about it versus when you see them do it. but you could ask, again, about the whole life history from interview data. So.
So I'm thinking about the whole concepts of learning, like being able to catch fish or go hunting. People not only need to train their physical skills, but also their knowledge about different species of fish and what is the wave like. So when you consider the source of learning, like from parents and from other peers, seems to me there are a bunch of possibilities mixed together in this whole process that it could have observed other peers or their parents for certain knowledge that are necessary for later practice of these skills. So I think this is an open thought and want to know how you think about that's going to influence the source of teaching, like oblique transmission or horizontal transmission.
So first, I mean, I think people obviously learn in a variety of ways, not just through teaching. And so I think the answer is that this is why I'm looking at variation in the frequency of teaching, so that it's more present for skills that are of high difficulty in terms of skill, because those are things that are hard to learn through other ways. But then you have sort of the reverse influence, which is that parents are just more likely to teach, but they're less likely to be experts in any particular thing because you only have 2 parents, but you have the whole population to find an expert. So parents are less likely to have knowledge in those highly difficult tasks, but they're more willing to teach. And so you get kind of maybe 2 types of teaching going on. You get the expert low effort or maybe compensated kind of teaching. So like with the boat example, the boys that somehow learn from accompanying these men on the boat, they learn how to drive a boat, but they have to do a ton of work up front to even get access to be on the boat. So there's that might be like one ideal type of teaching. And then you have parents who are willing to teach a lot more, but maybe don't have the best knowledge. And so you might see like different stages during the life history. And that's some of what I'm showing, separating out those effects. But it's, of course, complicated. So. Yeah.
Going back to the earlier talk about
Social tolerance.
Social tolerance. Is what you're getting at, this may have already been said, I just didn't quite follow, that in sort of Dan's example, his grandson sticking his finger in his nose doesn't help him learn about the computer, but for whatever reason, if it did, then that could be teaching whether or not you intended for that help, or you represented his mental states in any way, or did anything like that. If it doesn't have those affordances, then it's not teaching. But if it does,
I agree. That's why I said the observer, that is Michelle, is inferring some intention in classifying that, right? That is, you have to somehow you're distinguishing.
I mean, I'm inferring a function, not necessarily an intention.
It could just be functional. It doesn't have to be intentional.
So I'm inferring that as a result of people tolerating these kids in a particular circumstance, their learning is facilitated, but it doesn't.
Well,
It's a function. It's not a psychological state that I'm inferring. That's all.
Fair enough, but presumably children learn something about the world every time we do anything. So he's learning something about my nose. You know? I mean, he's learning something. So all of those are teaching instances.
But it's not potentially. But I mean, I guess in this particular frame of the computer, like he's not learning something about the computer, so it's not related. It's not teaching related to that.
No, it's teaching related to human morphology or something.
Right, and that
and
that could be true.
Then you have you reduced it to the banal. All that you have then is that kin are tolerant. Period. You don't have to have teaching at all, because we already know that kin will allow offspring to do things to them that non-kin will not.
So then you get back to some sort of learner adaptation that if you do see this differential tolerance, that should be a cue to the learner, pay attention to this in particular for
Yeah, that's where I say the fact that the kids get shooed away sometimes is significant, right? So if the same individual sometimes says, get the hell out of here, and other times says, yes, you can in fact put your finger in the cake mix, even if it's implicit, I don't actually say that, I just don't shoot you away, then that's revealing, and that's where I'm suggesting that looking at the base rates math.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want to exclude cases like the basically nose-picking case that we're discussing. Leave it to Dan to come up with nose-picking as the main topic of discussion. Exactly. Exactly. So I think that when we get to talking about particular cases, then we get our gut feeling about what should count as teaching, and then our rules go by the wayside. So I wouldn't necessarily want to say, well, just because he's not learning about the computer, we should make some other rule to get rid of this case, because maybe he really is learning about the inside of the human nose, or he's learning something about social behavior.
But I don't think Dan's saying that he's not learning. It's a question, the learning, I think we can probably all agree, like, yeah, you can learn from all these different things.
Right.
Is it teaching for to tolerate that behavior?
Well, I mean, the way that I'm defining it is it solves the problem where there's motivation to learn about something, but there's no access. And so if by allowing interference, you are giving access to a child to some stimulus, even if it is the inside of your nose, then that is teaching. Because you know what, you're not going to provide that access to anyone. It's selective, right? You're not, I'm pretty sure that Dan would not allow us all access to the inside of his nose just because we want to learn about it, right? Maybe the wrong example. Yeah.
Also, in this instance, doesn't it matter if the child is interfering with something that the parent is doing? So if you were picking your nose, and the child then picks your nose,
I think probably inserting your finger inside someone's nose is going to interfere with anything that they're doing.
I'm talking about interfering with their activity in such a way that they're participating in the activity. Like sticking your finger in the cake mix is interfering with the activity, but if you're trying to stick your finger in the nose of the person who's making the cake, then you might get chewed away.
For me, the interference doesn't necessarily have to be related to the task that the person is doing, because it's not about what the person is doing, it's about what the child is trying to learn about. And if the tolerance of the adult, for example, is facilitating the child learning about something that they want to learn about, then it doesn't matter what the adult was doing. Are we over? Okay. Thank you.